walked into my mother's study expecting a family reunion. What I got was an execution. Everything goes to Matt. Mother's words hit me like a sledgehammer to the chest. No greeting, no small talk, just the cold blade of rejection cutting through 21 years of hope that maybe, somehow, I still mattered to this family. My brother sat behind our father's mahogany desk like he'd been born to it, a satisfied smile playing at the corners of his mouth. The family lawyer, Mr. Adams, shuffled papers nervously, avoiding my eyes. The house, Johnson Enterprises, the offshore accounts, all of it. Mother's voice carried the same icy authority that had crushed my spirit as a child. Matt has earned it. He stayed. He learned the business. He proved himself worthy of the Johnson name. I felt the walls closing in, the same suffocating sensation I'd experienced in this room countless times before. At 31, I was suddenly 10 years old again. The dreamer, the disappointment, the daughter who would never be enough. While you were off playing Mother Teresa, she continued, her words dripping with disdain, Matt was building his future, our future. He understands what it takes to maintain a legacy. I've been helping people, I managed to whisper, my voice barely audible. Veterans, women escaping abuse. Noble. Matt finally spoke, his voice mockingly gentle. But nobility doesn't pay dividends, Val. It doesn't build empires or secure futures. You chose your path when you walked away from us. The leather portfolio in my lap felt suddenly heavy. 5 years of documented impact, lives changed, families restored. None of it mattered here. In this room, my life's work was reduced to a child's fantasy. My purpose dismissed as weakness. You're too soft for this world, Mother said, echoing the same words she'd used to destroy my confidence decades ago. You always were. Business requires strength, decisiveness, the ability to make hard choices. You've proven you don't possess those qualities. I stared at the oil painting of my father behind the desk, the man who'd once told me I could achieve anything. His eyes seemed to mock me now. The papers are already signed, Mother announced with finality. It's done. I was erased. Again. I walked out of that study feeling like I'd been stripped of everything, but the truth was more complicated. I hadn't lost my inheritance. I'd given up my birthright 21 years ago when I chose love over legacy. At 18, while Matt was studying business at Harvard, I was falling in love with David Martinez, a social worker from the wrong side of town. Mother had made her position crystal clear. Choose him, and you choose poverty. Choose him, and you choose to be nobody. I chose him anyway. We married young and poor, living in a cramped apartment while I put myself through social work school. David worked double shifts at a community center, and I waited tables between classes. We were broke, exhausted, and completely happy. We had dreams of changing the world, one person at a time. Those were the most honest years of my life. No trust funds, no safety nets, just two people building something real from nothing. When I graduated, we moved to Detroit to work with veterans returning from overseas. The work was heartbreaking and beautiful, watching broken men find their way back to themselves, helping families reunite, creating hope where there had been none. David and I planned to have children, to build our own family legacy based on compassion instead of conquest. But life had other plans. He died in a car accident 3 years into our marriage, leaving me alone with our shared mission and a grief so deep I thought it might kill me. I could have come home then. Mother would have welcomed the prodigal daughter, especially one humbled by tragedy. But I stayed. I threw myself into the work, establishing shelters, counseling programs, support networks. I built something meaningful from the ashes of my broken heart. For 5 years after David's death, I lived on donations and determination. I slept on couches, ate cheap meals, wore secondhand clothes. I watched Matt from a distance through social media and family updates, his expensive suits, his penthouse apartment, his steady climb up the corporate ladder. He was becoming everything Mother wanted: ruthless, successful, worthy. Meanwhile, I was becoming everything she despised: idealistic, giving, concerned with people over profit. The irony wasn't lost on me. While Matt learned to manipulate board meetings, I learned to navigate human suffering. While he studied market trends, I studied the human heart. He accumulated wealth, I accumulated purpose. But sitting in that study, none of it seemed to matter. All my sacrifice, all my growth, all the lives I'd touched, dismissed as weakness by the woman who gave me life. The cruel truth was that I'd known this day would come. I'd always known. The days following the inheritance announcement felt like psychological warfare. Matt invited me to stay in the family home until I figured things out. A kindness that felt more like a calculated move to keep me close and vulnerable. Every morning, I watched him leave for the Johnson Enterprises headquarters in his tailored suits, carrying the confidence that came with knowing he owned everything. Every evening, he returned with stories designed to remind me of my place. "The Detroit project called today," he mentioned casually over dinner one night. "They're struggling without you. Funding issues, apparently. Sarah, wasn't that the veteran you were so attached to? She's back on the streets." His words were poison wrapped in concern. He'd done his research, learned the names of people I cared about, and was using them as weapons against my already fragile confidence. Mother was more direct in her cruelty. She'd leave financial magazines on my nightstand with Matt's photo. On the covers, articles praising his visionary leadership and strategic brilliance. She'd schedule business calls in the room next to mine, speaking loudly about company profits and expansion plans, making sure I heard every detail of the empire I'd never inherit. "You could still have a place here," she told me one afternoon, her voice dripping with false maternal warmth. Matt mentioned creating a small charitable division within the company. "You could oversee community outreach, make a modest salary. It would suit your temperament." The offer was designed to humiliate. A charitable division, a consolation prize for the daughter who chose conscience over capital, a way to keep me dependent, grateful for scraps from the table I should have been sitting at. But the worst part was how they made me doubt myself. Late at night, alone in my childhood bedroom, I started questioning every choice I'd made. Had I been naive? Had my idealism been weakness disguised as virtue? When I looked in the mirror, I saw a 31-year-old woman with nothing to show for her sacrifice, but a portfolio of good deeds that meant nothing to the people who mattered most. Matt had a particular talent for psychological manipulation. He'd praise my work publicly while undermining it privately. "Valerie's heart is so big," he'd tell visitors. "Sometimes I worry she's too generous for her own good. She gives everything away and keeps nothing for herself." The implication was clear. I was irresponsible, impractical, unable to make sound decisions. He painted my generosity as a character flaw, my compassion as evidence of poor judgment. Even worse, he'd share carefully chosen details about my years of struggle: the secondhand clothes, the shared apartments, the times I'd gone without meals to help someone else. He presented these as cautionary tales, evidence of what happened when someone chose feeling overthinking. Slowly, insidiously, they were breaking me down, making me believe their version of my story. The turning point came on a Tuesday morning, when I overheard Matt on a phone call in Father's old study. I'd been walking past when his voice stopped me cold. "She's exactly where we need her, broken and grateful," he was saying, his tone casual, almost amused. Mother was right. A few weeks of the right pressure and she's practically begging for scraps. The charitable division idea was genius. She'll take it and feel lucky to get it. I pressed myself against the wall, my heart pounding as his words sank in. "No, she's not a threat," he continued. "She's too soft, too emotional. 20 years of playing saint has made her weak. She actually believes her little humanitarian projects matter more than real power. The laughter that followed was like ice in my veins. Trust me, by the end of the month she'll be so grateful for any position in the company that she'll never question the inheritance again. She'll be our pet charity case, and everyone will see her exactly as we do, the Johnson daughter who couldn't handle the real world. I stood there for several minutes after he hung up, my body trembling with a mixture of rage and clarity I hadn't felt in years. The fog of manipulation that had been clouding my judgment lifted completely, and I saw the situation with brutal honesty. They hadn't been trying to include me or help me find my place. They'd been systematically destroying my confidence, making me so desperate for acceptance that I'd settle for humiliation. Every kind gesture, every seemingly generous offer, every expression of concern, it had all been calculated. But something else crystallized in that moment. As I stood in the hallway where I'd once played as a child, I realized that their assessment of me wasn't entirely wrong. I had been soft. I had been naive. I had been allowing them to define my worth based on their twisted values, but I wasn't weak. The woman who had built shelters from nothing, who had helped broken people rebuild their lives, who had survived grief and poverty and still chose to serve others, that woman wasn't weak. She was something they couldn't understand and couldn't control. I walked quietly to my room and opened my laptop. For the first time in weeks, I didn't feel the crushing weight of inadequacy. Instead, I felt something I'd almost forgotten: my own power. I began researching Johnson Enterprises with the same methodical attention I'd once applied to grant applications and program development. I studied financial reports, board compositions, company policies. I read every article about Matt's leadership, looking not for praise but for patterns. What I found was revealing. The company was profitable, yes, but there were troubling trends. Employee turnover was high. There had been 3 sexual harassment settlements in the past 2 years. Environmental violations had been quietly settled out of court. Most importantly, I discovered that Father's will was more complex than they'd led me to believe. That night, I made a decision that would change everything. I called Mr. Adams at 7 a.m, catching him before he left for the office. His voice was cautious when he heard my name. "Valerie, I wasn't expecting to hear from you. I need to see my father's complete will," I told him, my voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through my veins. Not the summary that was read in Mother's study, the entire document. There was a long pause. That might not be appropriate. Your mother is the executor and... Mr. Adams, you were my father's lawyer for 30 years. You watched me grow up. You know I have the right to see the full document. I kept my tone respectful but firm. I'm not asking for anything illegal. I'm asking for transparency. Another pause, then a heavy sigh. Meet me at my office at 9. Come alone. I arrived 15 minutes early, my nerves electric with anticipation. Adams looked older than his 68 years, the weight of secrets visible in the lines around his eyes. He gestured for me to sit across from his cluttered desk. "Your father was a complicated man," he began, pulling a thick folder from his safe. "He loved you and Matt equally, but he understood you differently. He saw your strength, Valerie, even when you couldn't see it yourself." My heart hammered as he opened the folder, revealing pages of legal documents I'd never seen before. "There's something your mother chose not to mention during that meeting," Adams continued, his voice barely above a whisper. "A codicil your father added to his will 3 months before he died. He was concerned about what might happen if your mother ever tried to completely disinherit you." He slid a single page across the desk. The legal language was dense, but the meaning was crystal clear. If Margaret Johnson attempted to leave me nothing, or if she tried to distribute the inheritance in a way that completely excluded me from the family business, a failsafe would trigger. I would become the majority shareholder of Johnson Enterprises. He called it his insurance policy, Adams explained. watching my face carefully. "He said you were the one with real vision, real integrity. He was proud of Matt's business acumen, but he worried about his character. Your father believed that if push came to shove, you were the only one who could lead the company with honor." The document trembled in my hands. All this time, while I'd been accepting their version of events, while I'd been allowing them to make me feel worthless, I had actually held all the cards. "Why didn't you tell me this before?" I asked, my voice thick with emotion. Adams looked uncomfortable. "Your mother threatened to destroy my practice if I revealed the codicil unless it became legally necessary. She hoped you'd simply accept the inheritance as presented and walk away. But when you stayed, when you kept asking questions..." He shrugged helplessly. "I couldn't let you be deceived any longer." I stared at the paper, seeing not just legal text but my father's love, his faith in me, his final gift. Everything had just changed. "What happens now?" I whispered. "Now," Adams said with the first smile I'd seen from him, "you decide what kind of leader you want to be." I walked out of Adam's office carrying the weight of a secret that could destroy everything Matt and Mother had built. But I didn't rush home to confront them. I didn't burst into the study waving the codicil like a weapon. Instead, I did something they would never expect from the weak daughter they thought they knew. I went to a coffee shop and planned. For the first time in weeks, I felt like myself again. The woman who had navigated Detroit's complex social services system, who had built coalitions between rival organizations, who had turned abandoned buildings into sanctuaries for the forgotten. That woman was strategic, patient, and devastatingly effective when she chose to be. I ordered a large coffee and opened my laptop, creating a document I titled simply, Project Renaissance. If I was going to take control of Johnson Enterprises, I wasn't going to do it just to prove a point. I was going to transform it into something Father would have been proud of. For 3 hours, I researched everything I could find about the company's current operations. The financial reports told one story: steady profits, consistent growth, impressive quarterly returns. But the deeper I dug, the more troubling patterns emerged. Johnson Enterprises had contracts with 3 companies that had been cited for labor violations in the past 18 months. Their environmental compliance record was technically clean, but only because they'd paid substantial fines to avoid admissions of guilt. Most damning of all, their employee satisfaction surveys, buried deep in HR documents I accessed through a former colleague's corporate database subscription, painted a picture of a toxic workplace culture. Women reported feeling unsafe reporting, harassment. Employees of color described a promotion system that seemed designed to keep them in lower positions. The company's charitable giving, which Matt often bragged about in interviews, amounted to less than 0.5% of annual profits, most of it going to organizations that served the wealthy rather than those in need. This wasn't just a business empire. It was a machine designed to extract maximum profit while giving minimum consideration to human cost. But it was also an opportunity. I began drafting what I called my transformation plan. Instead of simply taking control and firing people, I would methodically address each problematic area. I'd establish real oversight for workplace harassment. I'd audit all vendor relationships and sever ties with companies that exploited workers. I'd create genuine community investment programs, not just tax write-off charity events. Most importantly, I'd do it all quietly, professionally, and with the kind of dignity that had always been my strength. The plan would take months to implement properly. I'd need to identify allies within the company, people who shared my values, but had been silenced by the current culture. I'd need to understand the complex web of relationships that kept the current system in place, and I'd need to prepare for the inevitable backlash when Matt realized what was happening. By the time I closed my laptop, the sun was setting. I'd spent the entire day planning not just a corporate takeover, but a complete cultural revolution. The shy, traumatized woman who had walked into that coffee shop was gone. In her place sat someone Matt and Mother had never met before. Valerie Johnson, CEO. I drove home slowly, savoring the weight of the secret I carried. Tonight, I would play the part of the defeated daughter one last time. I would let them believe. Their manipulation was working. Let them think I was broken and grateful. Tomorrow, everything would begin to change. But they would be the last to know. I became a ghost in my own family home, moving quietly through the halls while gathering intelligence like a detective working a cold case. Matt and Mother thought my silence meant defeat. They had no idea I was studying them with the same intensity I'd once applied to understanding trauma patterns in abuse survivors. The performance required every ounce of my acting ability. During breakfast, I listened to Matt's condescending advice about finding my place in the world, while memorizing the names of board members he casually mentioned. When Mother offered to arrange informational interviews with her charity friends, I nodded gratefully while mentally cataloging her casual remarks about company politics. "You should consider the Riverside Foundation," she suggested one morning, buttering her toast with the same precision she applied to crushing dreams. "They help unfortunate women. It would suit your background." "That sounds perfect," I replied, my voice carrying just the right note of humble appreciation. Inside, I was burning with rage at her casual dismissal of the hundreds of lives I'd impacted, but I kept my expression grateful and defeated. My real work happened in the hours they thought I was sleeping or sulking. I reached out to my network of social workers, nonprofit directors, and community organizers, people who understood the value of discreet information gathering. Within a week, I had insider perspectives on Johnson Enterprises from 3 different angles. Maria Santos, who ran a women's shelter in Chicago, had tried to partner with Johnson Enterprises 2 years ago for a corporate sponsorship program. "Your brother's assistant was polite," she told me during a carefully casual phone call, "but they made it clear they weren't interested in that kind of charity work. They wanted high-profile events with photo opportunities, not actual impact." James Wright, a veterans advocate I'd worked with in Detroit, had a more disturbing story. We applied for a grant from their Community Development Fund last year. The application process was designed to exclude organizations that serve low-income communities. You needed references from board members of major corporations, minimum operating budgets that eliminated grassroots organizations, and location, requirements that basically meant you had to serve wealthy neighborhoods. But the most valuable intelligence came from Teresa Martinez, a senior manager in Johnson Enterprises' Human Resources Department, who had reached out to me after hearing I was in town. We met at a small restaurant across town, away from company eyes. "I've been with the company for 8 years," she told me quietly, her hands wrapped around her coffee cup like it was an anchor. "I've watched good people get forced out for asking the wrong questions. I've seen harassment complaints disappear into filing cabinets. I've watched your brother promote people based on loyalty rather than competence." Teresa was exactly what I'd hoped to find. Someone with institutional knowledge, shared values, and the courage to speak truth. She was also desperate for change. "The employees are demoralized," she continued. "Turnover in some departments is over 40% annually. We're hemorrhaging talent because people don't want to work in a toxic environment. But your brother sees the turnover as proof that people can't handle the demanding culture he's created." I listened carefully, asking strategic questions while maintaining the facade of someone who was simply curious about the family business. By the end of our conversation, I had a clear picture of the company's vulnerabilities and a potential ally in the transformation I was planning. That night, I updated my files with methodical precision. I was building a case, gathering evidence, and preparing for a campaign that would be unlike anything Matt had ever faced. The best part was that they thought I was broken. 3 weeks into my silent campaign, Matt made the mistake that gave me the perfect opportunity to strike. He called a family meeting to discuss my future with the company, confident that he'd broken me down enough to accept whatever scraps he was willing to offer. "I've been thinking about our conversation regarding the charitable division," he began, settling behind Father's desk with the arrogance of someone who believed he held all the power. "I'm prepared to offer you a position as Director of Community Outreach. The salary would be modest, of course, but it would give you purpose and keep you connected to the family business. Mother nodded approvingly from her chair, clearly pleased with what she saw as her son's generous gesture toward his pathetic sister. The position would be part-time, Matt continued, and you'd report directly to me. I think it's important that we maintain proper oversight of any charitable initiatives. We can't have emotional decision-making affecting the company's reputation. The condescension was breathtaking. They were offering me a job at my own company, a job designed to keep me busy and grateful while ensuring I had no real power. They expected me to thank them for the privilege of being their token charity case. I let the silence stretch for several seconds, watching them both shift slightly in their chairs. Then I smiled. Not the grateful, defeated smile they expected, but something entirely different. That's a very interesting offer, Matt, I said quietly. But I'm afraid there's something we need to discuss first. I reached into my briefcase and withdrew the folder Adams had given me, placing it carefully on the desk between us. I had a conversation with Mr. Adams last week. It was quite enlightening. The color began to drain from Matt's face, though he was clearly trying to maintain his composure. I'm not sure what you mean. I mean this. I opened the folder and slid the codicil across the desk. Father's insurance policy. The amendment that makes me majority shareholder of Johnson Enterprises. If you ever tried to completely exclude me from the inheritance, the silence that followed was deafening. I watched Mother's face cycle through confusion, recognition, and finally, pure rage. Matt stared at the document like it might burst into flames if he looked at it hard enough. You see, I continued, my voice steady and calm. While you were busy congratulating yourselves on manipulating the weak little sister, I was discovering that Father had more faith in me than either of you ever did. And that's impossible, Mother whispered, her voice cracking for the first time since I'd known her. Harold would never. He would, and he did. I leaned back in my chair, feeling the power shift like a physical force in the room. He saw exactly what would happen. He knew you'd try to push me out, to make me feel worthless and grateful for scraps. So he made sure that if you ever went too far, I'd have the ability to take control. Matt's hands were shaking now. This can't be legal. We'll contest it. You'll lose. I kept my voice gentle, almost sympathetic. Adams confirmed the validity. The board will have to recognize my authority once I present the documents. And given the current state of employee morale and the company's recent legal troubles, I suspect they'll welcome new leadership. For the first time in my adult life, I watched my mother and brother realize they weren't in control. The woman they'd dismissed as weak and impractical had outmaneuvered them completely. But here's what's really going to happen, I said, standing slowly. I'm not going to destroy you or humiliate you publicly. I'm not going to fire you or throw you out of the company. I'm going to do something much worse from your perspective. I gathered my papers and headed toward the door, pausing to look back at their shocked faces. I'm going to prove that Father was right about me all along. The war began the next morning. I woke to find my phone buzzing with messages from board members, company executives, and business reporters. Somehow, word of the inheritance change had leaked, and Matt was already spinning the narrative in his favor. The first call came from Robert Chen, the company's chief financial officer. His voice was carefully neutral, but I could hear the uncertainty beneath his professional tone. Ms. Johnson, I received some concerning information this morning about potential changes in company leadership. I think it would be beneficial if we could schedule a meeting to discuss the situation. I spent the morning fielding similar calls, each one revealing pieces of Matt's strategy. He wasn't going down quietly. Instead, he was positioning my takeover as a hostile coup by an inexperienced outsider who would destroy everything the company had built. The story he was telling was masterfully crafted. Valerie Johnson, the wayward daughter who had abandoned her family responsibilities to play activist, was now trying to seize control of a successful company she didn't understand. He painted himself as the dedicated son who had sacrificed everything to build the family legacy, only to be betrayed by legal technicalities and paternal favoritism. By noon, I'd received 3 requests for emergency board meetings and 2 calls from business journalists wanting to interview me about the family drama unfolding at Johnson Enterprises. Matt had weaponized the media, turning my legitimate inheritance into a public spectacle designed to undermine my credibility before I could even take control. But the most devastating blow came in the form of a legal document delivered to my door at 2 p.m. Matt was challenging the codicil's validity, claiming that father had been under duress when he signed it, possibly suffering from early-stage dementia that affected his judgment. The lawsuit sought to have the amendment declared invalid and to restore the original will's terms. The legal papers painted a picture of a confused old man being manipulated by lawyers and influenced by his guilt over neglecting his daughter. It was character assassination disguised as legal strategy, and it was brilliant in its cruelty. What made it worse was that Matt had clearly been planning this contingency for some time. The lawsuit included medical records from father's final months, testimony from doctors about his occasional confusion, and statements from company executives about his declining mental acuity during board meetings. I sat in my childhood bedroom, surrounded by legal documents that portrayed my father as senile and me as a manipulative opportunist, and felt the familiar weight of their psychological warfare settling over me. For a moment, I almost believed their version of events. Maybe father had been confused. Maybe I was being naive about my ability to run a company. Maybe Matt was right to fight me. Then I remembered the phone call I'd overheard 3 weeks ago. Matt's casual cruelty as he discussed breaking me down, his laughter as he described making me grateful for scraps. I remembered Teresa's stories about employees being silenced and harassed. I remembered the reports of environmental violations and labor abuses that Matt had swept under the rug. This wasn't about family legacy or business competence. This was about power and control, and Matt would destroy anyone, including our father's memory, to keep it. That evening, I called Adams. His voice was weary when he answered, clearly anticipating this conversation. "I saw the lawsuit," he said before I could speak. "It's aggressive but not unexpected. Your brother has hired Kellerman and Associates. They specialize in estate disputes." "Can they win?" I asked, trying to keep the fear out of my voice. "They'll certainly try. But Valerie, I was present when your father signed that codicil. I can testify to his mental state, his clear intentions, his specific reasons for including it. He wasn't confused or manipulated. He was protecting you from exactly what's happening now." Adams paused, then continued with something that sounded like admiration. "Your father told me something that day that I've never shared with anyone. He said, 'Matt thinks business is about winning at any cost. Valerie understands that real victory comes from lifting others up while you rise. She's the one who can save this company from becoming something ugly.'" I closed my eyes, feeling father's faith in me like a warm hand on my shoulder. "So what do we do?" I asked. "We fight," Adams said simply. "And we remind everyone who your father really was and what he really wanted." The battle for Johnson Enterprises was about to begin in earnest. I refused to fight Matt's war on his terms. While he was busy spinning narratives and filing lawsuits, I was doing something he'd never learned how to do: building genuine relationships. My first move was to schedule individual meetings with every board member, not to lobby for their support, but to listen. I sat in their offices and asked questions Matt had never thought to ask. What were their biggest concerns about the company's direction? What opportunities were they seeing that weren't being pursued? What kept them awake at night? The answers were revealing. Board member after board member expressed variations of the same concerns. The company was profitable but directionless, successful but soulless. They talked about missed opportunities in sustainable technology, about talented employees leaving for competitors, about a corporate culture that seemed increasingly at odds with modern expectations. "Your brother is excellent at maintaining what exists," Dr. Patricia Williams, the board's longest-serving member, told me during our coffee meeting. But maintenance isn't leadership. This company hasn't innovated in 5 years. We're living off your father's vision, but we're not building on it. I didn't pitch myself as the solution. Instead, I shared my observations from 3 weeks of studying the company's operations. I talked about the correlation between employee satisfaction and productivity, about the business case for ethical practices, about markets we were missing because we weren't thinking creatively about social impact. The most successful companies of the next decade will be those that understand that profit and purpose aren't mutually exclusive, I explained to James Morrison, the board's youngest member. They're actually multiplicative. Engaged employees work harder. Ethical practices build consumer loyalty. Community investment creates new markets. I wasn't speaking from theory. I had data. Years of grant writing and program evaluation had taught me to measure impact in ways that translated directly to business metrics. I could demonstrate how investing in employee wellness reduced turnover costs, how community partnerships opened new revenue streams, how environmental responsibility actually improved operational efficiency. Meanwhile, Matt's media strategy was backfiring. His portrayal of me as an inexperienced outsider fell apart when reporters actually researched my background. The Detroit Free Press ran a feature about the veteran housing program I'd developed, including interviews with former homeless veterans who were now employed and stable. The Chicago Tribune highlighted my work with domestic violence survivors, complete with statistics showing the measurable impact of the programs I'd designed. Valerie Johnson isn't just a social worker with good intentions, wrote business journalist Sarah Kim in a widely shared LinkedIn article. She's a proven leader who has built sustainable organizations, managed complex budgets, and created measurable social change. The question isn't whether she can run a business. It's whether the business world is ready for her kind of leadership. The real breakthrough came when Teresa approached me with an idea. What if we could show the board what employee engagement actually looks like? She suggested during one of our discreet meetings. Not just surveys and reports, but real demonstrations of what happens when people feel valued and heard. We organized what we called listening sessions, informal meetings where employees could share their experiences and ideas directly with board members. I didn't position these as criticism of current leadership, but as opportunity assessment. What innovations were employees proposing that weren't being heard? What inefficiencies could be solved by people who actually did the work? The sessions were revelations. Employees presented ideas for cost-saving measures, new product developments, and process improvements that could save the company millions. They talked about workplace policies that hindered productivity and suggested changes that could improve both morale and performance. Most importantly, they demonstrated something Matt had never understood, that respecting people's intelligence and humanity actually made business sense. By the end of the week, I wasn't just the legitimate heir fighting for control. I was the candidate with a vision for the future. The truth about Matt's leadership came from an unexpected source. His own arrogance. 3 days after the employee listening sessions, I received a call from Maria Gonzalez, a junior accountant in the finance department. Her voice was barely above a whisper when she asked if we could meet somewhere private. I heard about the sessions, she said as we sat in a small cafe miles from the office, about how you're actually listening to people. I've been wanting to speak up for months, but... She looked around nervously, then pulled a manila folder from her bag. There are things happening in the company that aren't right. Financial things. What Maria showed me was damning. Over the past 18 months, Matt had been using company funds for personal expenses, disguising them as business expenditures. A $50,000 consulting fee to a firm that turned out to be owned by his college roommate for services that were never actually provided. Business trips to luxury resorts that had no corresponding meetings or deals. Equipment purchases for his personal use charged to company accounts. But the personal expenditures were just the beginning. Maria had discovered a pattern of financial manipulation that went much deeper. Matt had been inflating project costs and pocketing the difference through shell companies. He'd been taking kickbacks from vendors in exchange for lucrative contracts. Most seriously, he'd been manipulating quarterly reports to hide losses and inflate profits, creating an illusion of success that kept board confidence high while the company's actual financial health deteriorated. I tried to report this through proper channels, Maria explained, her hands shaking as she spoke. But my supervisor told me to mind my own business. When I persisted, I was told that questioning executive decisions could be grounds for termination. That's when I realized the corruption goes beyond just your brother. The evidence was meticulously documented. Maria had been secretly copying files for months, building a comprehensive case that would be impossible to dismiss or cover up. She'd done it because she believed in the company's potential and was horrified to watch it being destroyed from within. "Why are you showing me this?" I asked, though I suspected I knew the answer. "Because you're the only person with enough power to stop it, who might actually care about doing the right thing," she said simply. "Everyone else is either part of the system or too afraid to challenge it." That evening, I called an emergency, meeting with Adams and 2 forensic accountants I'd worked with on nonprofit audits. We spent the night reviewing Maria's evidence, cross-referencing it with official company records, and building an airtight case. The picture that emerged was staggering. Matt had embezzled nearly $2 million over 18 months. He'd created a network of fake vendors and inflated contracts that funneled money to his personal accounts. Most damaging of all, he'd been reporting false financial data to the board and shareholders, a federal crime that could result in serious prison time. "This isn't just theft," one of the forensic accountants told me grimly. "This is securities, fraud. If this gets out, it won't just destroy Matt's career. It could destroy the entire company's reputation and stock value." I stared at the evidence spread across Adam's conference table, feeling a mixture of vindication and sadness. Part of me felt triumphant. This proved that Matt was exactly the corrupt, selfish person I'd always suspected he was. But another part of me mourned for the brother I'd once loved, the family that could have been, the company father had built with integrity that had been perverted by greed. "What do you want to do with this information?" Adams asked quietly. It was the moment that would define not just my leadership of Johnson Enterprises, but the kind of person I would choose to be in victory. I could destroy Matt publicly, use the evidence to humiliate him and Mother, prove definitively that I was the moral superior they'd always claimed I wasn't, or I could handle this the way a real leader would. "First, we secure all the evidence and present it to the appropriate authorities," I said firmly. "Then we figure out how to protect the company and its employees from the fallout." Matt made his choices, but 2,000 people work for Johnson Enterprises, and they don't deserve to suffer for his crimes. Adam smiled with something that looked like pride. "Your father would be proud of how you're handling this." "I hope so," I replied, staring at the evidence of my brother's betrayal. "Because this is just the beginning." I called Matt at 7 in the morning and asked him to meet me in Father's study. My voice was calm, professional, the tone of someone who held all the cards and knew it. He arrived 20 minutes later, still wearing yesterday's clothes and the haunted look of someone who suspected his world was about to collapse. The lawsuit, challenging Father's codicil, had been quietly withdrawn the night before, and I could see in his eyes that he knew why. "We need to talk," I said simply, gesturing for him to sit across from Father's desk, the same desk where he'd announced my disinheritance 6 weeks ago. I slid the manila folder across the polished wood surface. "Maria Gonzalez is very thorough. $2 million, Matt, shell companies, fake invoices, securities fraud. The forensic accountants have verified everything." His face went through a series of expressions: shock, denial, calculation, and finally, defeat. For several long moments, neither of us spoke. The morning light streaming through the windows illuminated the dust motes dancing between us, and I thought about how this room had witnessed so many pivotal moments in our family's history. "I can explain," he said finally, his voice hollow. "I'm sure you can. You always were good with explanations." I leaned back in Father's chair, feeling the weight of authority settle around me like an inherited cloak. But I'm not interested in explanations, Matt. I'm interested in solutions. He looked up sharply, clearly expecting accusations and threats rather than business discussion. Here's what's going to happen, I continued, keeping my voice steady and professional. You're going to resign from Johnson Enterprises immediately. You're going to return every penny you stole, including interest. You're going to cooperate fully with the internal audit we're conducting to ensure there are no other financial irregularities. And if I refuse, then the federal prosecutors, who are already reviewing this case, will receive copies of everything. The SEC will launch a formal investigation. The media will have a field day with the story of the Johnson heir who embezzled millions while suing his sister for control of the family business. Matt's face crumpled. For the first time since we were children, I saw him cry. Not the manipulative tears he'd used to get his way, but the genuine anguish of someone watching their life implode. I never meant for it to go this far, he whispered. It started small, just a few expenses here and there. But then the pressure to show profits, to prove I was worthy of running the company. It spiraled out of control. The pressure you put on yourself, I corrected gently. Father never asked you to prove your worth through corruption. Mother never demanded you steal to maintain appearances. You chose this path. He was silent for a long time, staring at his hands. When he finally looked up, there was something different in his expression. Not the arrogance I'd grown accustomed to, but something that might have been genuine remorse. What happens to me now? That depends on you, I said. You can make this right. Return the money, resign quietly, seek help for whatever drove you to make these choices. Or you can fight this and watch everything you've ever cared about get destroyed in the process. And Mother? Mother will have to face the reality that the son she believed in has been lying to her for years. That's between you and her. Matt nodded slowly, the fight finally going out of him completely. I'll resign today. The money. Most of it is still accessible. I can return it within the week. Good. I stood up, feeling both victorious and exhausted. Matt, for what it's worth, I take no pleasure in this. I wanted us to be better than this. He looked up at me with something that might have been respect. You are better than this. You always were. I just couldn't stand it. As he left the study for the last time, I remained seated in Father's chair, thinking about power and responsibility, about the weight of legacy and the price of integrity. In 6 weeks, I'd gone from the dismissed daughter to the rightful heir, from victim to victor. But victory felt different than I'd expected. It felt like work was just beginning. My first day as official CEO of Johnson Enterprises began at 6 a.m. with a company-wide email that I'd spent 3 sleepless nights writing and rewriting. I wanted to strike the right tone, acknowledging the recent turmoil without dwelling on it, outlining my vision without making promises I couldn't keep. Dear Johnson Enterprises family, it began. Change is never easy, but it's often necessary for growth. Today marks the beginning of a new chapter for our company, one built on the values of integrity, respect, and genuine partnership with the communities we serve. I'd deliberately chosen the word family because that's how I wanted our employees to feel, valued, heard, and integral to our success. The response was immediate and overwhelming. My assistant, who I'd inherited from Matt's administration, told me she'd never seen anything like the flood of positive emails from employees at every level of the company. The real work began with systematic reform. I established an anonymous reporting system for workplace concerns, partnered with external auditors to ensure complete financial transparency, and created what I called innovation councils, cross-departmental teams empowered to propose and implement improvements. Teresa Martinez, who had been quietly supporting ethical practices for years, became my Chief Human Resources Officer. Together, we overhauled the company's promotion and compensation structures, ensuring that advancement was based on merit and contribution rather than politics and favoritism. For the first time in 8 years, I'm excited to come to work, she told me during one of our weekly strategy meetings. People are actually sharing ideas instead of hiding them. They're collaborating instead of competing destructively. The transformation wasn't just internal. I redirected our charitable giving toward organizations that created measurable community impact, established partnerships with local nonprofits, and launched a program that allowed employees to dedicate paid time to volunteer work. The initiatives weren't just moral imperatives. They were smart business that improved our reputation, attracted top talent, and opened new markets. Most challenging was rebuilding our relationship with Mother. She'd been devastated by Matt's resignation and the revelations about his financial crimes. For weeks, she barely spoke to me, moving through the house like a ghost of her former imperious self. The breakthrough came on a Tuesday evening when I found her sitting in Father's study, holding a framed photo of our family from when Matt and I were children. She looked older than I'd ever seen her, fragile in a way that made my heart ache despite years of her cruelty. "I failed him," she said without looking up. "I made him think he had to be perfect, that love was conditional on success. I created the pressure that drove him to." She couldn't finish the sentence. I sat down beside her, something I hadn't done since I was a child. "You didn't make Matt's choices for him. We all have to own our decisions." "But I made you feel worthless," she continued, tears flowing freely now. "I convinced myself that pushing you away was protecting you from a world I thought you couldn't handle. Instead, I almost destroyed the one child who actually understood what your father built this company to be." The apology I'd waited my entire life to hear came in broken whispers and genuine remorse. She told me about her own childhood, about parents who'd valued achievement over affection, about fears and insecurities that had shaped her into the cold, demanding woman I'd known. "I don't expect forgiveness," she said finally. "I just want you to know that I see you now. I see your strength, your vision, your incredible heart. You're everything I should have celebrated instead of criticized." Forgiveness, I realized, wasn't something that happened in a single moment. It was a choice I'd have to make repeatedly, a process of healing that would take time and patience from both of us. "We can't change the past," I told her, taking her hand for the first time in decades, "but we can choose how we move forward." By the end of my first quarter as CEO, Johnson Enterprises had achieved record employee satisfaction scores, landed 3 major new contracts based on our reputation for ethical practices, and been featured in Harvard Business Review as a case study in values-driven leadership. But the metric that mattered most to me was simpler. People felt heard. They felt valued. They felt proud to work for a company that stood for something beyond profit. I was building the legacy Father had envisioned, and I had finally learned to claim. 1 year later, I stood in the same marble foyer where this journey had begun. But everything had changed. The harsh shadows cast by the crystal chandelier seemed softer now, and the house that had once felt like a mausoleum of judgment had become something warmer. A home where healing was possible. Sarah, the veteran I'd helped in Detroit, was visiting as part of Johnson Enterprises' new Veterans Integration Program. She wore a crisp business suit and carried herself with the confidence of someone who'd found not just housing, but purpose. She now ran our community outreach initiative, bringing the same determination that had helped her survive homelessness to the task of helping others rebuild their lives. "I never thought I'd see the inside of a place like this," she told me as we walked through the halls filled with family portraits. "But it doesn't feel intimidating. It feels welcoming." That transformation hadn't happened overnight. It had required difficult conversations, hard choices, and the kind of patient persistence I'd learned in my years of social work. We'd had to let go of employees who couldn't adapt to our new culture of respect and accountability. We'd had to rebuild relationships with clients and partners who'd lost trust during Matt's tenure. We'd had to prove, day after day, that our commitment to ethical leadership was real and sustainable. The company's success had exceeded everyone's expectations. Our employee retention rate was now industry-leading. Our community partnerships had opened doors to new markets and innovative projects. We'd been invited to speak at conferences about corporate social responsibility and business schools were teaching case studies based on our transformation. But the numbers, impressive as they were, weren't what mattered most to me. What mattered was the culture we'd built, a place where Maria Gonzalez, the junior accountant who'd risked her career to expose corruption, now served as our director of financial ethics. A place where Teresa Martinez had been promoted to vice president and was helping other companies develop their own employee empowerment programs. Mother had surprised everyone, including herself, by becoming one of the company's most effective board members. The vulnerability that had emerged from her crisis of faith had revealed a woman capable of genuine wisdom and compassion. She now mentored young female executives, sharing hard-earned lessons about the dangers of valuing achievement over authenticity. "I spent 40 years trying to mold you into someone you were never meant to be," she told me during one of our monthly dinners. "Now I spend my time helping other women avoid the same mistake I made, believing that strength requires hardness, that leadership demands cruelty." The evening news was featuring a story about Johnson Enterprises' latest initiative, a partnership with local schools to provide job training and mentorship programs. As I watched young people talk about finding hope and opportunity through our programs, I thought about the path that had brought me here. I'd started this journey feeling like a failure, convinced that my choices had cost me everything that mattered. I'd been manipulated, dismissed, and nearly broken by people who confused power with worth. But in learning to stand up for myself, I'd discovered something more valuable than inheritance or revenge. I'd found my voice. The lesson wasn't that good always triumphs over evil, or that virtue is automatically rewarded. The lesson was simpler and more profound, that dignity maintained in the face of cruelty becomes unshakable strength. That choosing compassion over conquest doesn't make you weak, it makes you transformational. As I climbed the stairs to my childhood bedroom, now transformed into a comfortable office where I often worked late into the evening, I passed the photograph that had haunted me for years, the family portrait where I'd always felt like an outsider. Tonight, for the first time, I saw something different in that young girl's eyes. Not weakness or naivety, but quiet determination. Not someone who didn't belong, but someone who was waiting for her moment to lead. Father's voice seemed to whisper from the walls. Leadership isn't about being heard above others. It's about creating space for others to find their voices too. I'd built that space. I'd proven that you don't need to shout to be powerful, don't need to crush others to succeed, don't need to abandon your values to achieve your goals. Sometimes, the greatest victory is simply refusing to become what the world tells you must be to matter. I sat at my desk, looking out at the city lights and thinking about tomorrow's challenges and opportunities. There were still problems to solve, people to help, changes to make. The work would never be finished, and that was exactly how I wanted it. For the first time in my life, I was exactly who I was meant to be. I hope you enjoyed today's story. Subscribe to the channel so you don't miss more stories like this. Give it a like and comment below what you thought of the story. See you in the next video.